Hey everyone, welcome to our first online lecture for Unit 4, Key Concept 4.1. And our focus today will be debating democracy in America. So I'll give you a second to read the key concepts and the sub-concepts, which are always super important. So feel free to pause it, read them if you'd like. In addition to that, if you would like a link to this presentation, you can find that link on the bottom of this page. So let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so here's a little graphic organizer that's going to kind of guide us through our discussion today. But basically, what we see happening is that Americans during this period from 1800 to 1848, they're struggling to define democratic ideals, and they're also struggling how to spread these democratic ideals. Okay, so what we're seeing is during this period of time, we see a lot of debates about federal power and the role of the federal government in America. For instance, where do states lie? Can the federal government boss states around? Do the states have the power? So there very much is this very hotly contested debate about federal and state, state rights essentially. So that's one of the things we're going to look at today. We're also going to see Americans kind of look at America during this period, and many Americans are going to recognize that there is a hypocrisy in America, meaning that we say all these things that all men are created equal. We say that people have God-given rights, but it's pretty glaringly obvious that you look at Native Americans, you look at African Americans, you look at women during this time, and they are enjoying the equality and the freedoms that, white males are. And so there is an attempt to reform the American system during this period, okay? And we also see subcultures developing during this period because some people are kept out of mainstream America. Groups like, for instance, African Americans and Native Americans, and they're forced to develop their own distinct cultures, which obviously we can still see today. There's definitely some subcultures, in America. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. The first thing we have to understand, and we talked about this in our last unit, Unit 3, that originally, America wasn't really that democratic. We discussed in class how elitist our founding fathers might have been, how they kind of looked down upon the average American. They believed, for instance, that the elite and the well-bred and the well-educated, they're the ones that really should be kind of running the show. And as a result, we see a government that's set up with very undemocratic things in it, like the Electoral College, the how the Senate is elected, how the Supreme Court is put into place, the presidential veto. There's all these safeguards put into place in the Constitution to keep the common man, to keep the average American from having too much influence. And what we see happening, and this is an important trend, I think, is that we see the average American getting more and more voice in their government. Okay, and so this is kind of the beginning of that. We see the development of mass democracy in America. And throughout the 1820s and throughout the 1830s, we see property restrictions for voting pretty much going away. Some states hold on to it. Virginia holds on to it up until 1860. But all the new states in America, as we move out west, they're granting universal suffrage to white males. And so that's an important trend that we see taking place in America, is this kind of extension of suffrage. Not just to rich white males who own property, but to, white males in general. And obviously you're sitting there and you're like, well, what about women? What about minorities? And obviously we know that that's going to come much later. But we do see this first important step taking place, and we see white males being extended suffrage, and we see the formation of an American identity beginning to take place. And that American identity very much surrounds democracy. Americans during this period were very into politics. They ate, slept, and dreamt politics. We read about politics. In fact, there's an interesting stat here. 17 million Americans had more newspapers and magazines than all of Europe. And Europe had 233 million at that time combined. So Americans read an astounding amount of literature, on politics. They were very, very into it, okay? And it very much began to shape, the American identity. Um, It's also interesting during this period that we see partisan politics getting involved in periodicals back then. So political parties, like the Democrats or the Whigs or the Federalists, they would pretty much control certain news sources, and they would basically slant those news sources to their benefit. And it's kind of interesting because today, obviously, at this time, we know that cable news and talk radio, it's pretty hard to find unbiased accounts of what is going on. Classic MSNBC for the liberals and Fox News for the conservatives. And so we can very much see a parallel of today to back then, how we see even news sources being slanted to one side. But like I said, democracy is beginning to shape an American identity. 90% of white American men could vote by 1840. The European Alexis de Tocqueville, who came to America, the Frenchman, to understand democracy, he saw mass democracy as being very much an American development. European democracy was much snootier than American democracy. In Europe, democracy was kind of limited to the elite, much like how it was in Rome and in Greece. But really, mass democracy is very much an American development. And as a result, it begins to shape, like I said, an American identity. Americans, we vote. And in fact, even to this day, Americans take pride in their voting. We put the I voted sticker on it. But yeah, like I said, American democracy became an integral part of being an American back then. Elections were giant parties. They would have celebrations, bonfires, mass meetings, party conventions. People talked about it all the time. I mean, it was very much an important part about who an American was back then. Okay? However, it is important for us to recognize that while democracy and participating in democracy was very much becoming part of the American identity, we still have groups that are excluded from that. We have African Americans, we have women, we have Native Americans who aren't allowed to be part of the process. And there are arguments put forth arguing that, yeah, they're inferior or they shouldn't bother to vote. Or they don't really want to be involved. In fact, Thomas Jefferson said about women that they wouldn't want to wrinkle their brow thinking about politics. So while democracy is shaping the American identity, we do have to recognize that there are still groups that, aren't really involved much. And this is something that we still kind of debate today. There's still kind of debates on who should vote. Are there restrictions on voting? At the time this video is made, we have a lot of debates going on about felony disenfranchisement. There are some states that don't allow felons to vote. So you committed a crime and it was a felony, you go to jail, you get out, you can't vote. And so there's a lot of people that argue that. There's voter ID laws that are becoming the big thing in the 21st century. Can you put these new restrictions on voting? And if you look at, who are adults without valid photo IDs, you can see that there's a large percentage of Americans who don't have photo IDs. So you have one side of America that says, hey, this makes our voting legit. There's no fraud. Why wouldn't we do this? And there's the other side that says, but wait, you're basically saying that a huge chunk of these people can't vote, and that's not cool. So even to this day, we still are kind of debating who can vote, who can't vote, what restrictions should be put on voting. And it's very much kind of this thing that's been going on for quite a while now. So anyways, now that we become this like super democratic nation that debates all these things, we do want to talk a little bit about what are some of the early debates that are going on. And one of the big points of contention during this period is that people really debated what was the role of the federal government. Should the federal government be kind of weak or should it be powerful? And we see political parties popping up pretty much debating this issue. We have the first party system that develops in America, and that's the Federalists versus the Democratic Republicans. And we've talked about them at great length. The Federalists, they want a strong central government. The Democratic Republicans want a weak central government. And then the Federalists go and die after the War of 1812, partially because they look very unpatriotic because of the Hartford Convention and everything they were talking about there. And we don't have a political two-party system for a while there. We have kind of the era of good feelings where we have just the Democrats. But then we do see a second party system developing. We have the Whigs kind of rising out of the Federalist essentially. And they're, once again, what are they debating? They're debating the role of the government. They're debating whether or not the federal government can recharter the Bank of the United States. They're debating whether the federal government can spend money for internal improvements. They're debating tariff policy. They're debating Andrew Jackson. But more importantly, states' rights and nullification. So much of the debates going on are, what is the role of this federal government? They're kind of establishing the precedent that we live with today. So anyways, we also see regional disputes popping up that are kind of creating a lot of debate. Early on in the early 1800s, New England, for instance, had a lot of problems with the federal government. They felt like it was pretty much just dominated by Virginia. They complained about the Virginia dynasty, how all the presidents except John Adams were from Virginia. We see at the Hartford Convention, we see the New Englanders are becoming very irritated with their diminishing power. They very much want to hold on to their regional power, and every new state that comes into the Union means that they're becoming less and less powerful. They want to eliminate the Three-Fifths Compromise because they feel like the Three-Fifths Compromise gives the South too big of an advantage. In fact, they called Thomas Jefferson the Negro president because he was elected because of the Three-Fifths Compromise. And New England's also pretty much complaining about all these trade policies that really hurt them. Jefferson's Embargo Act, the War of 1812, was very unpopular in New England because that really hurt them. And so we really, once again, we're seeing these intense debates taking place over, the federal government and what is their role and stuff like that. Unfortunately for the Federalists, this convention looked very unpatriotic, and like I said, they ceased to exist over that as well. We also see regional debates popping up in the South. The South is getting kind of irritated. The South really doesn't like the idea of tariffs because tariffs make things more expensive for them, and they're paying these high tariffs, and they hate that. But then these tariffs are going to build roads and bridges and canals, mainly in the North. And the South's like, wait a second, what's up with that? Why should we be paying all these tariffs that then go and benefit the northern states? And plus, the Constitution doesn't say that the federal government can even build these roads and canals. So as a result, is this even legal? And so we're seeing all these debates taking place once again about what is this role of the federal government. We also see during this time, though, that there starts to become an answer. Under the Marshall Supreme Court, Marshall's the Chief Justice, we see the Supreme Court assuming a massive amount of power. Okay, Marbury versus Madison in 1803 establishes the right of judicial review, which basically says the Supreme Court has the last word on the constitutionality of federal laws and acts. And this basically gives, like I said, gives the Supreme Court the right to be the kind of the judge or the referee of the United States of America. And this very much strengthens the federal government at the expense of the states. McCulloch versus Maryland, a later Supreme Court case, this gives the Supreme Court the power to review state laws. And so once again, here's an example of the federal government kind of assuming all this power. And the states are like, whoa, what's going on here? You guys can't be doing all that. And they're very much, like I said, is this debate about, once again, the power between the states and the federal government. How much power should the federal government have? And these are some hotly contested debates going on here, okay? We see, once again, the power between the states and the federal government kind of rearing its ugly head in the nullification crisis. I've already talked a little bit about tariffs. But tariffs were very much a regional issue. The North loved the idea of high tariffs. Why? Because high tariffs protected their growing industries, mainly textile industries in New England. The South did not like the idea of tariffs because tariffs made manufactured goods that they needed from Europe much more expensive. And so here we see an example of regionalism where the North loves the idea of tariffs, the South hates the idea of tariffs. And that issue is going to kind of split Americans, okay? So we have the Tariff of Abominations that is passed in 1828. This jacks up the rate on tariffs significantly on manufactured goods. The South Carolinians, they're an interesting group of people back then. They freak out about this. John Calhoun, who's the scary-looking dude on the right there, he basically protests the tariffs, and he basically writes an essay basically suggesting that states have a right to nullify federal laws. And he pulls on some of the concepts of the Kentucky and the Virginia resolutions that were penned by Thomas Jefferson and James Adams, saying that, you know what, if laws are unjust or unconstitutional or just, unfair in general, the state should have a right to nullify those and basically not follow them. President Jackson at the time is a dude you don't want to mess with, and he basically sees this as a threat to federal power. And while personally he might not love the idea of tariffs, and personally he might, be someone that is somewhat sympathetic to Southerners, he's not going to tolerate this challenge to federal law. So Jackson gets Congress to pass the Force Act, which basically is going to give him the power to send in the military to enforce these tariffs. South Carolina threatens secession if that goes into place. And thankfully, Henry Clay steps in, the great compromiser, and he's able to basically come up with an agreement between South Carolina and the federal government that the South Carolinians are happy with. And they basically kind of walk off the cliff or walk off the ledge here a little bit. Ironically enough, though, South Carolina did nullify the Force Act. But once again, we're seeing these debates taking place about, the role of the state and federal government in America. And now this issue is settled, right? I mean, you couldn't even imagine, for instance, like a state banning Obamacare, for instance. Like if Governor Walker of Wisconsin, which is where we're from, obviously, if he were to just say, yeah, we're not going to follow Obamacare, you'd be like, that's crazy. That's a federal law. Like no one even thinks like that anymore. But back then, that was a debate that was going on, and it's important that we understand that. So anyways, we also start to see debates over slavery starting to kind of pop up during this time, and we're also seeing the creation of a Southern identity during this time. The Southerners don't really industrialize, they don't really urbanize like the North is starting to do during the 1800s. The South pretty much doubles down on plantation economy, the growing of cash crops like cotton and tobacco and stuff like that. And so they start to become very unique to the other regions of America. We see the South being much more aristocratic than the North. They're very elitist. They have this code of honor that we don't see in other parts of the country. In fact, dueling was very popular back then. And we also start to see kind of a different opinion of slavery developing during this period. While the founding fathers like Washington and Jefferson were slaveholders, they recognized that slavery was evil, that it was immoral, and that it wasn't something that people should strive for. Washington freed his slaves. Jefferson was very much in debt, couldn't free his slaves, had to sell his slaves upon his death, but he wrote about the evils of slavery. This next generation of Southerners, though, they seem almost to embrace slavery as something that is natural, that, in their opinion, the Negro was inferior, and this was their natural state. And so we start to see kind of this defense of slavery beginning to pop up in the South, where you have all these authors and famous politicians basically defend slavery as it's natural. We shouldn't look at it as evil. It's just the way it is. There's been slavery throughout human history. We're no different. This is just the way slavery is. And so we're starting to see the creation of a Southern identity, and it's pretty much based on slavery. And they're going to become very unique, obviously, compared to the rest of the country. Okay? So anyways, now we just talked about slavery here. One of the things that we're going to see taking place during this period is that we're going to see these new ideas that are popping up in America. People are going to look at America, and they're going to see them as being kind of hypocritical. And people are going to try to perfect America, to make America like that perfect place. And it kind of starts with religion here. We have the Second Great Awakening popping up. And basically the Second Great Awakening is people are kind of getting freaked out here that, Americans, really don't have that religious fervor that some people want them to have. In fact, it's estimated that only 10% of Americans went to church on a weekly basis in the 1790s. Now, that's not to suggest that only 10% of Americans believed in God. It may be it's because the distance was too great to travel to go to church. I mean, who knows? I would assume, I can't prove this, but I would assume that pretty much everyone back then believed in some sort of higher power. But regardless, there was this push to basically, let's get people kind of back on the bandwagon of Christianity here. And so a lot of preachers like Charles Finney, for instance, they go around, they start, preaching the gospel and what have you, and they're basically inspiring people to live a Christian life, to make the choice to not live sinfully, but to live that Christian life, to live out the actions of Jesus of Nazareth. Okay, and one of the effects that this has is it actually inspires many people to launch reform movements, to be active in their society, to try to foster positive change. And so many people point to the Second Great Awakening of kind of getting women, especially, super jacked up here and getting women involved in perfecting society, whether it's the abolition movement, women's rights, reforming prisons, the temperance movement, banning alcohol. Women start to get very politically active. Even though women can't vote, they start to basically be a major push for social change in America. And we can kind of link that back to the Second Great Awakening. Okay? So we start to see people maybe get a little out of hand here, but we start to see people try to create the perfect society. Okay? People look at America, it sounds really good what we're founded on, but in reality, that's not what we are. So people are trying to perfect society, right? And so one of the things we see happening during this period is we see that utopian societies are attempted. People are trying to basically create these social experiments where they're trying to achieve perfection in life. So we see the Oneidas, we see Brook Farm, we see the Shakers, we see all these people attempting to live this perfect life. Now, some of these are fascinating. For instance, the Oneidas. The Oneidas practiced this interesting way of life where they didn't believe in marriage and that you could have as many sexual partners as you wanted. And eventually they even got into eugenics where they actually wouldn't let certain people have babies. They wanted to produce the perfect baby, so they would basically pick people to mate with each other. So it got really, really intriguing. And there's all these different utopian societies, and they're all very different. They're all very fascinating, but they're all part of this larger movement to perfect society. Okay. We also see, once again, slavery is kind of that black eye in America where it really does not shake well with our ideals of equality and freedom. And so it is during this period that we start to see an emancipation movement beginning. The slave trade is banned in 1808, which is obviously a positive development. The slave trade is a horrendous thing, the slave trade from Africa to the Americas, that is. And we're also starting to see a growing number of free African Americans through manumission. Manumission means the freeing of slaves. So we are starting to see a growing free African American population, and we're also seeing more support from white Americans like William Lloyd Garrison, who are starting to push for emancipation. Now, these people aren't perfect. Many of the people that push for emancipation, they're still people that I would call racist, and many of these are people that are saying, look, let's free the slaves because slavery is an abomination, but then let's send the slaves back to Africa. And so we actually see societies like the American Colonization Society, they actually start a colony called Liberia, which is still around today. In fact, if you've been following the Ebola crisis of what's going on right now, it's smack dab in the middle there. So Liberia is a place that is set up for freed slaves in America, and many go back. Not obviously a lot, but still many. And if you were to go to Liberia today, you would see a significant amount of ancestors or descendants, of American slaves. So once again, Americans are becoming keenly aware that slavery in America is hypocritical. And people are going to try to perfect society. They're going to try to change society to make America kind of line up with its ideals. And to a certain extent, we're still doing that today, I suppose. Okay? But while some Americans are trying to push for social change or trying to reform America, people are going to try to resist that. Okay? The Indian Removal Act. It's a great example where, Americans of the day are to continue to push Native Americans further and further west. We see Andrew Jackson in 1830 passing the Indian Removal Act, which removes all Native Americans east of the Mississippi to Oklahoma Territory, which included mainly the 5 civilized tribes of the Southwest, the Cherokee, the Choctaw, the Creek, Chickasaw, and Seminole. And so those tribes are moved further out west into Oklahoma, which is called Indian Territory for much of the 19th century. Okay, so here we can see a map of the Indian Removal Act. Once again, this is obviously not very American when you think about it. This is basically saying to people, you're inferior, we don't want you here, we want your land, get out. And they're being shipped out. So obviously one of the darker periods in American history here is the treatment of Native Americans. Many of these people die on the way to Oklahoma. The Trail of Tears is what it's called in some cases. And it's just like I said, it's a sad, sad development here. We also see during this time that when the abolition movement starts to grow in the North, the South defends slavery. And we see lots of pro-slavery arguments being put out there. Okay, the South very much gets defensive when they hear these abolition arguments in the North from people like William Lloyd Garrison or Frederick Douglass. And we start to see pro-slavery arguments. People point to the Bible and say, hey, look, in the Bible it says there's lots of things about slavery in the Bible. For instance, in Ephesians it says, slaves, obey your earthly masters with fear and trembling, with a sincere heart, as you would Christ's. So they point to biblical passages and they say, see, slavery is natural. Even God says it is. And so we're okay. We're not doing anything wrong here. The Southerners also look at slaves and say, look, yeah, I mean, are there some things about slavery that suck? Sure, but look at how industrial workers are treated up in your factories. That's not very nice. They also kind of point to just kind of racist ideas about science and the laws of nature, and they also show that, hey, look, all societies had slavery, so we're no different. So there is this pro-slavery argument. There's this pushback to the abolition movement. So there are people, once again, that are resisting change, and they're still trying to keep these people in their place. We see xenophobia during this time, meaning that there's anti-immigrants, anti-immigration, feelings. Nativism is what it's typically called, the fear of foreigners. We have a political party called the Know Nothing Party that pops up that attempts to restrict the flow of immigrants to America. In fact, it is during this period where Americans start to call themselves, white Americans that is, they start to call themselves Native Americans, which is somewhat comical. But anyways, once again, just another example of how people are kind of pushing back against this idea of equality and stuff like that for all people. In fact, we even see some incredibly racist and offensive images here, where you see a lot of anti-black sentiments. It became very common to have minstrel shows where you would have white actors basically cover themselves with black, face paint or what have you, and they would have these plays or shows where they would basically make African Americans appear to be inferior and just basically act incredibly foolish. And people would go to these shows and they would just laugh at how silly and inferior the African Americans were. These were intensely, obviously, very racist shows that were quite common throughout America during this time. So while we do see some pushes for ending the hypocrisy of America and making America truly an equal society that treats all people with dignity and respect, there are people that push back against that. And that is kind of a trend that we see throughout American history. In fact, you could still look at today and you could still argue that, hey, we are still trying to reach full equality for certain groups of Americans, whether it's women, whether it's minorities, whether it's gays and lesbians. The march towards full equality is still taking place. And there are still people that stand up and say, no, these groups of people shouldn't be granted that. And it's something that we've seen throughout history. And eventually, like I said, where it seems that we're kind of, marching that direction. So it's kind of interesting to look back at what was going on back then and kind of apply it for today. So anyways, so moving on, I guess kind of wrapping it up here. We didn't talk much about discriminated groups developing distinct cultures. We're going to talk more about that probably in the next unit. So hopefully, this lecture kind of helped you make sense of what was going on during this time, how, Americans were struggling very much with, what does our democracy mean? How does it work? And many Americans were asking, like I said, aren't we kind of hypocritical? Can we do things to make America really be America? So anyways, thanks for watching, guys. Sorry this went a little bit long, but feel free to ask me questions in either the comments section or face-to-face. Thanks.